I arrived at the house just before dusk. The air was thick with humidity, and a low mist clung to the trees that surrounded the property. From the outside, the mansion stood like a forgotten relic from another time. Its Victorian architecture had once been majestic, but now the wood was faded and cracked, and the windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the fading light. Despite its state of disrepair, there was still something imposing about it. A sense of history and power that had not completely withered away with the passing of years. The man who hired me had been vague about the details. All I knew was that I needed to stay in the house overnight, every night for the next week, to ensure that no one entered or tampered with the property before it was legally transferred to some unknown heir. It seemed simple enough. In fact, I was almost grateful for the solitude it promised. I needed the money, desperately. My debts had been piling up for months, and this job seemed like an easy way to keep the creditors at bay for a little while longer. All I had to do was keep watch and make sure nothing went wrong. Inside, the house was even more unsettling. It smelled of mildew and dust, like it hadn't been touched in years. The furniture was covered in white sheets, adding to the eerie, ghostly atmosphere. I could almost imagine that the house had been frozen in time, left behind by its occupants without a second thought. The thought nagged at me as I made my way through the main hall, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. Everything about the place seemed untouched. Yet there was a feeling of presence, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. I shook off the feeling. It was just nerves, I told myself. I had been stressed for months, working dead-end jobs, dodging calls from creditors, trying to keep my life from unraveling completely. Of course, I was on edge. This house was just another inconvenience, another thing to endure to get back on my feet. As the sun set and the last rays of light disappeared from the windows, I settled into one of the armchairs in what must have once been a grand sitting room. I had brought a small lantern and a book to pass the time. For the first hour or so, everything was fine. The house creaked occasionally, but that was to be expected in a place this old. I told myself it was just the structure settling, the wind brushing against the windows, the natural sounds of an aging building. But then I heard it, the first whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A low, breathy sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house. I sat up straight, my heart skipping a beat. I listened carefully, straining to hear it again, but all that followed was silence. I shook my head. It had to be the wind, or maybe the sound of the house settling again. I tried to focus on my book, but every few minutes I found myself glancing around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. An hour passed, maybe more. I had almost convinced myself that the whisper had been a figment of my imagination when I heard something else. This time, it was a soft creak, like a door slowly being opened. I stood up, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I wasn't imagining that sound. It was real, and it was coming from the hallway. I grabbed the lantern and walked slowly toward the noise, telling myself over and over that it was probably just the wind or maybe an old hinge that had given way. The hallway was long and dark, lined with old portraits of people I didn't recognize. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, but I forced myself to keep walking. At the end of the hall, there was a door, slightly ajar, though I could have sworn it had been closed earlier. I approached it cautiously, my pulse quickening. As I pushed the door open, I found myself staring into a small, dusty room. Nothing seemed out of place, just an old writing desk, a few shelves, and a single chair in the corner. But there was something about the room that felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, as if the space hadn't been disturbed in decades. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. I glanced at the floor and froze. There in the dust were footprints, small but clear as day. They led from the door to the writing desk and back again, though I knew I hadn't walked in that pattern. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't make sense. I had been the only one in the house. No one else was supposed to be here. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the footprints had been there when I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe someone else had been in the house recently, but even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. The dust on the floor was thick and undisturbed, except for those footprints. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me. I returned to the sitting room, my mind racing. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the wind had blown the door open. Maybe the footprints were old, and I had just missed them before. But as I sat there, staring into the dim light of the lantern, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispering returned later that night, more insistent this time. It echoed through the house, faint but distinct, and I found myself straining to catch the words, though they were always just out of reach. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat frozen in the chair, too afraid to move, too afraid to admit that something was terribly wrong. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, growing louder and more chaotic. It was as if the house itself was speaking. No, not speaking. It was breathing, alive in some dark, unseen way. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge. At some point, I heard what I thought were footsteps in the hallway again, but I couldn't bring myself to investigate. The fear had settled deep in my bones now, gnawing at me like a persistent, hungry animal. I told myself I would leave in the morning, that the job wasn't worth it, that no amount of money could make me stay another night in this cursed place. But as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I felt foolish. The fear that had gripped me so tightly during the night seemed to evaporate with the daylight. I laughed at myself, though the sound was hollow, forced. It was just an old house. Old houses made noises. That's all it was. I told myself I had let my imagination run wild. I cleaned up the sitting room, packed my things, and prepared to leave for the day. But as I stepped into the hallway, I glanced down at the floor. The footprints I had seen the night before, they were gone. The dust was undisturbed, as if no one had walked there in years. I stared at the floor, my mind racing. I couldn't have imagined it. They had been there. I knew they had been there. The feeling of unease returned, stronger this time, and as I stepped out of the house into the fresh morning air, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me from one of the darkened windows. And I knew I would have to come back. The second night began with a palpable sense of dread. As I drove back toward the mansion, I could feel my stomach knotting itself tighter with each passing mile. The day had been uneventful, but no matter how much I tried to push the memories of the previous night out of my mind, they lingered, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Every attempt to rationalize what had happened felt weak, hollow. By the time I pulled into the long, winding driveway, the weight of the house seemed to press down on me from a distance. It loomed there in the gathering dusk, waiting, as if it had never really let me go. Stepping out of the car, I hesitated at the front door, the key heavy in my hand. I could still feel the cold from the previous night, that creeping sensation that had never fully left me, even as the daylight had offered brief comfort. The house seemed darker tonight, the windows black holes sucking in what little remained of the fading light. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the mounting anxiety. A deep breath, and I pushed the door open. The air inside was different now, more oppressive, as if the house itself had grown heavier. I walked through the entryway, passing the furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts, and moved toward the sitting room again, my designated station for the night. Every step echoed louder than it should have, each creak of the floorboards sending a chill down my spine. Once settled, I tried to distract myself by reading. I even tried turning on some music on my phone, but the sound felt out of place, intrusive. The silence of the house swallowed the music as if it didn't belong here, and before long, I gave up. The shadows had grown longer as night settled in fully, and the air in the room felt thick, stagnant. There was a stillness that unnerved me, a quiet that felt unnatural, like the house was waiting for something. That's when I heard it again. The whispering. At first it was faint, a soft murmur barely distinguishable from the ambient noises of the house. But it grew, becoming more insistent, more defined. I set the book down, straining my ears. The sound was coming from the hallway. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was nothing. Just the wind, just my imagination. But the whispers weren't random, not the way the wind would be. They felt deliberate, as if words were forming, though I couldn't understand them. I stood up, my legs trembling, and grabbed the lantern. The hallway stretched before me, dark and empty, but the whispering continued, like voices just out of sight. As I walked toward the sound, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. It clung to me, like unseen eyes pressing against my back. I kept turning my head, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. The whispers led me deeper into the house, to a part I hadn't explored the previous night. The farther I went, the colder the air became, and the stronger the feeling of dread. Finally, I found myself standing in front of a door I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and the whispering seemed to be seeping from the gap like a thick, invisible fog. I hesitated. Everything in my body screamed for me to turn back, to leave, but something compelled me to push the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room that seemed untouched by time, like the rest of the house. But there was something different about it. The air was heavy with a staleness that made it hard to breathe. In the center of the room stood an old wooden table, and on it a single object, a tarnished silver locket. The sight of it made my skin crawl. It didn't belong here. Nothing had been moved or disturbed in the house, but this locket. It was like it had been placed here recently, deliberately. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch it. As soon as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a sudden rush of sound filled the room, a chorus of whispers, overlapping, frantic, as if 100 voices were speaking all at once. I staggered back, my heart racing, the whispers filling my ears, growing louder and more intense until they were almost screams. I grabbed the lantern and stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. I could feel it, like eyes boring into my skin, following my every move. The hallway felt narrower, the walls closer, as if the house itself was closing in on me. I rushed back to the sitting room, my hands shaking as I fumbled to relight the lantern that had blown out in my panic. The shadows seemed to dance around me, twisting and contorting in the flickering light. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, standing in the doorway. But there was nothing, just the empty, suffocating darkness. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. Every sound, every creak of the house set my heart racing. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a start, my head snapping up as I realized the lantern had gone out again. The room was pitch black, and for a moment I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. But then the whispering started again, closer this time. Louder. I shot up, frantically relighting the lantern. As the flame flickered to life, casting long shadows across the walls, I froze. In the dust-covered floor just a few feet from where I had been sitting, there were footprints. Not mine. They were smaller, like those of a child, and they led in a slow, deliberate line from the hallway to the chair where I had been sitting. I stared at them, my mind racing. There was no explanation. I hadn't moved from the chair, and no one else could have entered the house without me hearing. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the sound of my own labored breathing. The whispers had stopped again, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness of the house. As I reached the front door and yanked it open, I felt the weight of something pressing against my back, like invisible hands pushing me out. I stumbled into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Sitting there in the driver's seat, I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing. I looked back at the house, its dark silhouette towering against the night sky. The windows were black, lifeless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was standing just behind the glass, watching me. I knew I should drive away, leave the house and never come back, but something about it had its grip on me now. The money didn't matter anymore. The job didn't matter. There was something in that house, something old and sinister, and I couldn't just walk away from it. Not yet. I told myself I would return tomorrow, just to prove to myself that it was all in my head, that the whispers, the footprints, the feeling of being watched, it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The house was awake now, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. I drove away, but the whispers followed me, faint echoes in the back of my mind, growing louder with every passing mile. The third night was different. By now, the fear had settled in my bones, familiar yet still unwelcome. As I approached the house again, the dread that gnawed at me had transformed into something else: obsession. The rational part of my mind screamed for me to leave, to never set foot in that place again, but another part, a darker part, whispered back that I had to return. Something in the house had its claws in me, and no matter how much I tried to shake it, I knew I wouldn't be free until I understood what was happening inside those walls. I barely remember walking through the front door that night. My body was on autopilot, my mind already consumed by thoughts of what I might find. The air inside was even heavier than the night before, as if the house was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every moment I spent within it. The silence was oppressive, but it no longer felt empty. It felt alive. I could feel the presence now, something that had been dormant before but had awoken, and it was aware of me. I didn't bother sitting down this time. I needed to move, to understand. The whispers started almost immediately, barely audible at first, but growing in intensity as I wandered through the dark, narrow hallways. I followed them without thinking, driven by a strange sense of urgency, like I was being led to something. The air grew colder as I descended into the lower part of the house, my breath visible in front of me, curling in the frigid air. The basement. I hadn't explored it before, hadn't even noticed the door until now. It was hidden at the end of a narrow hallway, half concealed by shadows. The door was old, its wood cracked and splintered, but when I touched the handle, it was cold. Unnaturally cold, like the chill of death itself. I hesitated, the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, but the whispers were insistent now, louder, urging me forward. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a set of stone steps leading down into blackness. I could feel the cold air rising from below, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else. Something old and rotting. I gripped the lantern tighter, its light flickering weakly as if it too was afraid of what lay ahead. Each step down felt like a descent into madness, the stone beneath my feet rough and uneven, as though time had worn it away long before I ever set foot in this place. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened up into a wide, low-ceilinged room. The air was thick with moisture, the walls slick with condensation, and the floor uneven with dirt and old debris. But it was what stood in the center of the room that stopped me in my tracks. A figure. No, not a figure, a shape. Vague, indistinct, but undeniably there. It was formed out of shadow, its edges shifting and writhing like smoke. It didn't move, but I could feel it, watching me, aware of me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I would collapse under the weight of its presence. The whispers were deafening now, surrounding me, inside me, until I could no longer tell if they were coming from the house or from my own mind. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed for me to run, to get out of that place, but I couldn't. Something about that figure, about the shadows, drew me closer. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was fascination. I needed to know what it was, needed to understand why it was here. As I stepped forward, the ground beneath me shifted slightly, and something caught my foot. I stumbled, nearly dropping the lantern, and as I looked down, my heart froze. Half buried in the dirt at my feet were bones, small, fragile, unmistakably human. The sight of them should have terrified me, should have sent me fleeing from the basement, but instead, it was as if a switch flipped in my mind. I knew now, this place wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just a house with a tragic history. It was a tomb. A graveyard for whatever had been left behind. And that shadow, whatever it was connected to it all. The whispers, the cold, the sense of being watched. They were all tied to the thing standing in the center of the room. I crouched down, my hands trembling as I brushed the dirt away from the bones, revealing more of the remains. There was something twisted about them, something wrong. The bones were too small, too fragile, like they belonged to a child. But they weren't arranged naturally. They were scattered, broken, as if they had been carelessly tossed aside. The whispers surged, louder now, angry, as if my discovery had somehow upset the balance of the house. I stood quickly, backing away from the bones, my heart racing. The figure in the center of the room seemed to shift slightly, its edges growing sharper, more defined. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and malevolent, and for the first time that night, I felt true terror. I stumbled back toward the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The lantern flickered, its light barely holding against the darkness that pressed in around me. The whispers were inside my head now, swirling like a storm, and I couldn't tell if they were trying to warn me or drive me mad. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. As I reached the top of the stairs, I slammed the basement door shut behind me, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, but the air in the house felt suffocating, thick with a presence I couldn't escape. It was everywhere now. The house wasn't just alive. It was hungry, and it had its sights set on me. I stumbled through the hallways, disoriented, the walls seeming to shift and twist around me. The whispers followed, relentless, growing louder and more insistent with every step I took. I could feel the house closing in on me, its dark energy seeping into my mind, warping my thoughts, turning every shadow into something menacing. By the time I reached the sitting room, my vision was blurred, my thoughts fragmented. I dropped into the chair, clutching the lantern as if it were my only lifeline, the light flickering weakly in the darkness. I tried to calm myself, to focus, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They filled my head, screaming now, like a cacophony of voices all clamoring to be heard. I closed my eyes, pressing my hands to my ears, but it was no use. The house was inside me now. It had taken root in my mind, twisting my thoughts, feeding off my fear. I could feel it, growing stronger, more powerful with every second I spent within its walls. And the more I fought it, the more it tightened its grip. At some point, I must have passed out, because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. The light of the early dawn filtered weakly through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. The whispers had stopped, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I felt a sense of peace. But that peace was shattered the moment I looked down. The footprints. They were back, small, childlike, leading from the hallway into the room where I sat. But this time, they didn't stop at my chair. They circled it, over and over, like something had been watching me, pacing around me while I slept. I stared at the footprints, my mind numb with terror. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was in this house, whatever had been awakened, it wasn't going to let me go. Not yet. And maybe not ever. I couldn't leave. Not after what I had seen. The rational part of my mind knew I should get out, drive far away, and never look back. But the house had its grip on me, and every time I thought about leaving, a weight pressed down on me, something deep and unseen, making it impossible to act. I was drawn to it now, pulled into its darkness, the way a moth is pulled to a flame. There was no turning back. I had to see this through. The morning after the third night felt like a blur. My body moved automatically, performing the tasks of daily life. Eating, drinking, showering. But my mind was elsewhere, consumed by the house, by the thing in the basement, by the whispers that had finally quieted but still lingered in the corners of my thoughts. I tried to tell myself that I would only go back one more time, just one more night to understand what was happening, to figure out why the house had called me here, what it wanted from me. After that, I would leave. I promised myself I would leave, but even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. When dusk came again, I found myself back in the car, the road to the mansion stretching out in front of me like an endless, dark tunnel. The drive was shorter this time, or at least it felt that way. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but I kept driving, unable to stop myself. The mansion appeared out of the fog like a specter, standing tall and silent, waiting for me. Always waiting. The moment I stepped inside, the air hit me like a wall. The smell of damp and decay was stronger now, more oppressive, as if the house had begun to rot from the inside. The silence wasn't a relief. It was suffocating. I felt it pressing in on me, as if the very walls were closing in, sealing me inside. But still, I moved forward. The sitting room where I had spent so much of the last few nights now felt foreign, almost hostile. The chair where I had slept was still there, the lantern still flickering weakly on the small table, but I didn't sit down. There was no time for that now. I had to go deeper. The basement called to me, its presence a dark shadow in the back of my mind. As I made my way through the hallway, I noticed something strange. The floor was different. The dust that had once coated everything in the house was disturbed, as if someone or something had been moving through the halls after I left. I followed the faint trails of footprints, too small to be mine, yet too large to be a child's, leading deeper into the house. My pulse quickened as I realized they were leading me back to the basement. I reached the door at the end of the hall, the one that led down to the basement, and paused. The air around it was colder than the rest of the house, so cold that my breath misted in front of me. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. The whispers were back, faint at first, like they were coming from somewhere far below, but growing louder with every second I stood there. I opened the door. The basement steps stretched out in front of me, descending into blackness. The lantern's light flickered, barely piercing the gloom. I took a deep breath and began my descent, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. With each step, the air grew heavier, colder, until it felt like I was wading through something thick and suffocating. When I reached the bottom, the room felt different than before. The shadows were deeper, darker, as if the basement had grown larger in my absence. The figure in the center of the room was there again, still and silent, but somehow more real. Its form was clearer now, its edges no longer shifting and indistinct. It wasn't made of shadow anymore. It was something else, something solid, something alive. I moved closer, the whispers growing louder, swirling around me in a chaotic, maddening cacophony. The air felt thick with malevolence, like the very walls were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I could feel the presence behind the figure, something ancient and angry, something that had been buried here long before I ever set foot in this house. The bones were still there, scattered at the figure's feet, but now there were more. Dozens more, half buried in the dirt, like the earth itself had been disturbed. My stomach turned as I realized what I was looking at. The remains of people. Children, maybe. There were too many bones, too small, too broken. I felt the bile rise in my throat, but I couldn't look away. That's when I heard it, the sound of breathing. Slow, deliberate, coming from just behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering stopped, replaced by that low, rhythmic breath. It was so close, I could feel the cold air of it on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, terrified of what I might see. There was nothing, just the darkness, the oppressive silence filling the space where the whispers had been moments ago. But the feeling didn't leave me. I could still feel it, the eyes on me, the breath against my skin. The figure hadn't moved, but something else was here, something unseen. I backed away slowly, moving toward the stairs, but the air grew heavier with every step, as if the house itself was trying to keep me from leaving. My heart raced, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I needed to get out. I had to get out. Suddenly, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. The breath behind me returned, louder now, more frantic. I could hear footsteps, soft shuffling coming from the shadows around me. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. I stumbled, groping blindly for the steps, but they seemed farther away than they should have been. Then something touched me. Cold fingers, brushing lightly against my arm. I screamed, lurching forward, scrambling up the stairs as fast as I could. The whispers erupted again, louder than ever, filling my head with 1,000 voices, all screaming, all demanding something from me, but I couldn't understand. I didn't want to understand. I just needed to escape. I burst through the basement door and slammed it shut behind me, my chest heaving, sweat pouring down my face. But the feeling didn't leave. I could still hear the whispers, faint now, but constant. The presence, it hadn't stayed in the basement, it had followed me. I stumbled through the house, disoriented, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I reached the front door, I stopped. Something was wrong. The air felt different, warmer. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by a strange, almost comforting heat. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the hallway. The figure from the basement was standing there, at the far end of the hall, watching me. It was no longer a vague shadow. It was clear now, unmistakable. A tall, gaunt figure, its face obscured by darkness, but its eyes burned with a fierce, unnatural light. They were fixed on me, unblinking, and I knew. It was no longer content to stay in the basement. It was coming for me. I bolted through the door, nearly tripping over the steps as I ran toward my car. The night air was cold, but it felt like a relief after the stifling heat of the house. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably, before finally getting the door open. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it as if that would somehow keep the thing from following. I sat there for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart still pounding. The house loomed in front of me, silent and dark, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it was still there. Watching, waiting. I drove away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was with me, that whatever had been awakened in that house had followed me, latched onto me. The whispers were gone, but the sense of being watched, that never left. And as I sit here writing this, I can still feel it.